Welcome to the Jewish Christian Studies podcast. This program is sponsored by King's Evangelical Divinity School. And now, here's your host, Ruben Gomez.
Dr. Gerald McDermott is an Anglican theologian. He teaches at Jerusalem Seminary and the Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. He retired from the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama, in 2020. He has taught many courses in the history of Christianity and Christian theology of world religions, and written, co-written, or edited 25 books and hundreds of articles. McDermott and his wife Jean attend Holy Cross Anglican in Crozet, Virginia, where he serves as priest in residence. He lectures and podcasts frequently. He and Jean have 3 grown sons and 14 grandchildren. One of the focuses of his academic research has been the meaning of Israel, and among his books, there is one in particular titled The New Christian Zionism, Fresh Perspectives on Israel and the Land, which is very relevant to our conversation today. Dr. McDermott, it's an honor to have you once again in our podcast. Welcome back.
Well, thank you, Ruben. It was good to be with you in the last podcast, and I look forward.
Yes, because I think we have a very, very interesting subject or topic that we need to discuss. It is often said that those Christians who support Israel and the Jewish people are Zionists. And of course, we all know that the word Zionist nowadays is not exactly a term of endearment. Mm-hmm. So how do you respond to the label Zionist?
Well, I agree with you, Ruben, if I may.
Of course.
And just call me Jerry. That Zionism is a bad term. It's a term of contempt. The Jews have been living on the land for 4,000 years plus, and Palestinians, actually, are relative newcomers. People has lived for so long on their own land and retained the same language and the same religion. It's not true of the Greeks or the Romans, for example. The Greeks have a very different religion today from what they had in ancient Greece. Their language is basically the same, but so too for the Romans. They have a very different religion today from what they had in ancient Rome. Only the Jews have retained their religion and their language and basically the same culture for 4,000 years. No other people on the planet can say that about themselves. And the land promise, for Christians, for us Christians, and your audience is a Christian audience. So when we think about Zionism as the Jews being on the land, and the Jews say, those who know their Bibles, and most of them do, at least to some extent, even if they're so-called secular Jews. And by the way, secular Jew in Israel is something very different from what it is in the West. We in the West think of a secular Jew as someone who's an atheist. But in Israel, most of your so-called secular Jews, they call themselves secular Jews simply because they don't like the rabbinic establishment of the rabbis who control the religion of Israel, but they still believe in God, most of them. And they still believe that nation has religious roots and ought to have those religious roots, and they like those religious roots, even if they disagree with the present religious establishment that controls the synagogue in Israel. So for us Christians, we need to know that the land promise is at the heart of what's called Christian Zionism. And the land promise is not just in the Old Testament. Now, I said in your last podcast with Ian Ruben that the land promise is repeated 1,000 times in the Old Testament.
That's right.
And contrary to what I was taught by my professors, both at the University of Chicago and the University of Iowa, The land promise is all over the New Testament. So, just to give you an example, Acts 13, verses 19 to 21. If your listeners, those who are watching this podcast, go to Acts 13, 19 through 21, they'll see there the Apostle Paul, when he's out in the mission field in Antioch of Pisidia in modern-day Turkey, he's speaking in a synagogue to both Jews and God-fearers. Now, the God-fearers are the Gentiles who came to the synagogue every Saturday morning because they just knew this religion with the God of Israel is the only true religion in the world. And the rabbis didn't say you have to become a Jew. You can sit here in the seats for the God-fearers, and as long as you worship the God of Israel with us, and you follow the 7 Noahide commandments, which are basically 10 commandments, you will have a share in the world to come, which is what we would call heaven. The new heavens and the new earth. And thousands of Gentiles took them up on that and didn't become Jews, but were what Jews then called righteous Gentiles. So Paul is speaking to this as an inheritance. He very explicitly repeats the land promise from the Old Testament, and it's very clear Paul believes it. And Paul believes we've been given the land. Now, we Jews are not in control of the land of Israel, as Paul was speaking. The Romans were. And that's because we Jews were disobedient to all the terms of the covenant. Reuben, I have found that so many Christians look down on Jews and they say, well, the reason why the Jews went into exile so many times is because they disobeyed the terms of the covenant. And they sort of have pride. We Christians haven't disobeyed the terms of the covenant. And I would say, really? You really want to say that? You really want to say that we have not disobeyed the terms of the covenant? Don't you know your good Christian theology? And if you're evangelicals, you evangelicals know that we're all sinners. We've all broken the terms of the covenant.
That's right.
So stop, please stop this condescension toward Jews as if they have uniquely broken the terms of the covenant. And if God treated us justly, we would be in hell tomorrow or today. But thankfully, God is not only a God of justice, he's also a God of mercy.
Yes.
And that idea of God being not only a God of justice, but also of mercy, by the way, is rooted in the Jewish Bible. These Jewish people, the Holocaust proved that if we don't have a homeland, if we don't reclaim our homeland where we've lived for 4,000 years, we will be exterminated again. And as I speak, we are recording this podcast on March 11th, and the country of Iran is very close to nuclear capability, and they've stated publicly, we're going to wipe out the Israelis of the land of Israel. And they don't care if there's millions of Palestinian Muslims who live on the land, which they do. They don't care. So there could be a second Holocaust. There is good reason for the Jews to be Zionists, to have a homeland to protect from the anti-Semites all over the world who are particularly centralized in places like Iran. But in the Iranian leadership, of the Iranian people, can't wait for the Iranian leadership. The vast majority of the Iranian people can't wait for Israel or somebody to knock off the mullahs. Even talking strict historical politics, completely apart from the Bible. Politically, Zionism is part of international law. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in 1920, the League of Nations mandated a national home for Jews that originally included all of what's now Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza and Jordan. Now, the UN in 1947 then divided this, long before the 1947 division, the 1920 League of Nations mandate. Those in your watchers in this podcast, if you want to read more about this, I go into much detail about this in chapter 6 of my book, Israel Matters. So that's my long-winded answer to your question about Zionism.
No, that's fine. That's very insightful. Actually, most people think that Christian Zionism is a monolithic kind of position, but you and other authors have spoken of, and I'm quoting, new Christian Zionism. What are the main characteristics of this position, and why is it different from the old or classic Christian Zionism?
Right. It's interesting, Ruben, that you asked me this question today, because just yesterday, no, in fact, last night while I was sleeping, I got an email from an old friend in Budapest, Hungary, who is a professor at a university in Budapest and whose PhD student has just, or maybe she's a master's student, but she just wrote a 100-page book blasting Christian Zionism for all as being basically a wicked cabal.
Mm.
And really what the student, she's very smart and she's a very good writer, but all she knows is dispensationalism. And that's what most people know. That's what most Christian scholars know when they hear Christian Zionism. Oh, those dispensations. They're fundamentalists, they're uneducated, they're imperialists by default, they're colonialists because they support the Israeli colonialist project, and they're crazy. They've got all these crazy eschatological schemes. So look, yeah, I and a number of other scholars are in what's called the new Christian Zionism. And as you suggest in your question, it's new because it's totally different from the old Christian Zionism, which was dispensationalism. And a dispensationalism started only in the mid-19th century and is focused on something called the rapture, which is a belief really in three comings of Jesus. That there was the first coming in the first century, a second coming in the rapture where he's going to come down and pull off, and using the Latin word for seize, rapeo, and the past participle is raptus, thus rapture, all true beliefs from the face of the earth, and history is going to do. After the rapture, believing Christians. And for saving rapture, most of those in the new Christian Zionism don't believe in the rapture. The new Christian Zionism theologically and exegetically has nothing to do with a belief in the rapture. And the rapture is really central to much of dispensationalist thought. For all the things God's going to do with Israel and the rest of the world in the end times, whenever they start, we, in the new Christian Zionism, we are generally agnostic. We say generally, we don't know about all those details. We do know that Israel is part of the end times, that there's a future for Israel as Israel, and it's going to be significant in the culmination of the history of redemption. But that's about all we know. And that's about all we're willing to say. So that's
a big difference.
That's a big difference. So the new Christian Zionism has nothing to do with dispensationalism, structurally or in the details. But we believe in a future for the Jewish people, in God's providence, and God's eschatology, and a future for the land in God's redemption of the world.
Right. And from what I've been able to read myself, unlike the typical or standard Christian Zionist position, new Christian Zionism is also willing to admit, to say that Israel does not always act correctly. Is that right?
Right. Yes. Thank you, Ruben, for adding that. Not all dispensationalists, and a lot of them are, centered at Dallas Seminary. There's some good people there and friends of mine, and not all of them would say that Israel is never to be criticized. The state of Israel and the actions of the state of Israel, the decisions of the state of Israel are never to be criticized. But that has been common in much dispensationalism, that whatever the state of Israel does, we are never to criticize it. It must be God's will. And we new Christian Zionists, and in fact, I might recommend to your listeners the book, The New Christian Zionism. This book was published by InterVarsity Press in 2016. It's a scholarly book, tried to make it accessible to non-scholars.
Right.
Whenever we would introduce a theological term, we would always define it and try to put it in fairly plain English. So the New Christian Zionism, we have articles in there, by the way, by Palestinians. One great chapter, I think, by Shadi Khalul, who is loosely, the rest of the world would call him a Palestinian. He's actually a leader of the Aramean community. I mean, he's not a Jew. He's a leader of the Aramean community in northern Israel. And he talks about the history of his Aramean community with the state of Israel. And he's critical of the way of some of the ways in which the state of Israel has treated his Aramean community. They're all Christians and they're not Jews. So, in the broad sense of the term, you might call them Palestinians. So the New Christian Zionism does not write a blank check for everything that Israel does. So thank you, Ruben, for bringing up that significant difference.
Yeah, well, thank you. Now, as you well know, today there's been a very hotly debated issue. Many people, including many Christians, I would say, deny the links between the modern state of Israel, the Jews that live in Israel today, or the diaspora for that matter, the links with biblical Israel. In other words, the current state of Israel, the Jews today, generally speaking, have very little or nothing to do with biblical Israel. How would you counter that argument, very prevalent today?
Well, right. I would say, who make that claim, that Jews who live in Israel today have nothing to do, have no relation with Jesus, the apostles, who were all Jews, of course. The Jews of the first century of the New Testament era, that's not well grounded historically, is bad history. And it comes, I would say, they're seizing upon these theories, and I would say those are true conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories that are rooted in prejudice and supersessionism has a lot to do with it. Supersessionist theology feeds that sort of thing, because supersessionist theology says that God started a new thing with Jesus and the apostles called Christianity that was a total break from first century Judaism. And God was so upset, so angry at first century Jews that he basically destroyed them and drove them out of the land in 70, drove them out of the land in 135. And so it's the famous phrase about Jews, the wandering Jew. They wandered all over the world.
Yes.
And so the Jews today, and there's also, speaking of conspiracy theories, there is one that's become quite prominent that the Black Hebrews now are circulating, called the Khazar hypothesis behind the Ashkenazi Jews, who were the ones primarily settled the state of Israel after 1948. The Ashkenazi Jews are the ones who are primarily white from Eastern Europe, different from the Mizrahi Jews, the Sephardic Jews from North Africa, who are more brown-skinned. And you can see that in Israel today.
Yes.
And actually in Israel today, because of birth rates, the Mizrahi Jews, the Sephardic Jews are actually outnumbering the Ashkenazi Jews for various reasons. But this Khazar hypothesis of Ashkenazi ancestry, critics call it the Khazar myth because it is a myth. It says that the Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Khazar, and these were tribes in Middle Asia who converted to Judaism. Now, that's a historical fact. There were these Turkic peoples in Central Asia, in what we call the Caucasus and the Caspian steppe, before the great migrations from North Africa. But since these were the real founders of the modern state of Israel, and they really came from Central Asia, they are not Jews who go back to the first century in what's now the land of Israel.
I see.
And so that's proof that there's no connection between the Jews of Israel today. Of course, they're leaving out the Sephardic Jews, but supposedly that's the proof that there's no connection between the Jews of the first century, in New Testament Jews and the Jews of Israel today. But the problem with this theory is that we've done genetic studies on Jews in Israel today, and there's no substantive evidence of a Khazar root among Ashkenazi Jews today.
Well, the reality is that there is a nation state in the Middle East called Israel, and half of the Jewish population in the world today live in Israel, approximately. So, in your opinion, Jerry, how should we Christians relate to the nation state of Israel?
Well, I would say both for biblical and also social and political reasons, we should support the nation of Israel. Israel is certainly not perfect. It's made up of sinful human beings, and we Christians know something, or we believe something about common sinful human nature, and we should expect that every nation will be imperfect. And so we shouldn't be surprised if the modern state of Israel is not perfect. The Jewish people, as I gave a little bit of evidence from Romans in the last podcast, is still the chosen people. Paul spoke in the present tense, at least 25 years after the resurrection, when the majority of Jews still were not supporting Jesus, although tens of thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands were. Nevertheless, it was less than 50%. And Paul still said, they are, present tense, beloved. And their calling, which means God calling them to be his chosen people, is not to be revoked, is irrevocable. Use a Greek word for that. And so that's the people. And the land, Jerusalem is called the Holy City 5 times in the New Testament. In the bookend books, in Matthew, the first book, twice, and in Revelation, the last book, 3 times, called the Holy City. And Matthew and the book of Revelation, Matthew was probably written about 40 years after, still called the Holy City. The book of Revelation might have been written 70 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And certainly after the destruction of Jerusalem, it's still called the Holy City. I think that's significant.
It is.
The authors of the New Testament still referred to the land as a holy land. And, completely apart from the Bible, which even agnostics are conceding, the continued survival of the Jewish people over the millennia, when every major empire has tried to destroy them. Look at the book of Esther. The Persians tried to destroy them throughout the empire. And that was the world superpower then, Persia. And by the way, Jews are celebrating it this week as we record this podcast.
That's right. Yeah.
The continual survival of the Jewish people over millennia is a miracle. And especially their restoration to the land, their migration back to the land that started in the 18th century in a big way, which is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, not only Old Testament and New Testament. Well, Peter is speaking in Acts 3, in his second speech in Jerusalem, after the resurrection. And he talks in verse 21 about the future apokatastasis. Now, this is the word, Greek translation of the Bible, which was the number one Bible, not the Hebrew version, but it was the number one Bible for the early church. It was the Septuagint that they used. And apokatastasis is the Greek word for restoration, and referred in the Septuagint to the fulfillment of the biblical prophecies in the Old Testament that Jews from the 4 corners of the earth will return to the land. And Peter says, some weeks after the resurrection, this is coming in the future. It hasn't come yet. This biblical promise has not been fulfilled yet. So not, according to Peter, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, of course, fulfilled so many biblical promises about what the Messiah was going to do. He was the Messiah. But not everything. Not everything. There was still a return to the land from the four corners of the earth that was yet to come and had not taken place yet. Now, we know it didn't happen. It didn't start till the 18th century. 1700 years after Peter said, this is still to come. So it's a miracle. So even in terms of secular history, if you believe in a God and you believe that there are sort of historical miracles that continued survival of the Jewish people when everybody was, all the major empires have tried to destroy them. After 4,000 years, not just 2,000, 4,000 years is a world historical miracle. But also in terms of politics and freedom, the land of Israel today the state of Israel today is the only place in the Middle East where if you're a Jew or where if you're a Muslim or a Christian, you can have religious freedom. In most Muslim countries of the world today, I think there are 22 Muslim countries in the world today. You do not have freedom to practice your religion if you're the wrong kind of Muslim. If it's a Sunni country and you're a Shiite, watch out. If it's a Shiite country and you're a Sunni, watch out. You could be tortured and killed for practicing the wrong kind of Muslim faith. You can practice any kind of Muslim faith if you're a Palestinian Muslim in the state of Israel. If you're a Christian in a Muslim country, forget it. You will be tortured or killed, thrown in prison. If you're a Christian in Israel, just ask Shadi Khalil. He became at least a lieutenant in the IDF, and he led non-Jews into battle for the state of Israel. And he's very proud of that. He's run for office several times to serve in the Knesset. Now, he lost. He ran for office as a non-Jew in the state of Israel. That will never happen in any other country in the Middle East for a religious minority. Never, ever. And there are 2 million Palestinian citizens in the state of Israel proper. The West Bank, but live in Judea, Galilee. 2 million who get world-class education, world-class healthcare, and freedom to practice their religion the way they want to practice their religion in the state of Israel. That's an island of freedom. So Israel is an island of freedom surrounded on all sides by despotic countries where there's no religious freedom unless you have the preferred religion. There's very little political, there is no real freedom of speech, no real freedom of assembly, no real religious freedom, no political freedom if you don't support the autocratic regime. For that reason alone, we should support the state of Israel. And look, I've been telling Christians since October 7th, 2023, if we think it was right for Christians to support in World War II the war against the Nazis, because Nazism was a cancer on the face of the earth that, like all cancers, wanted to spread and eventually take over the world with the Tojos of the world in the Pacific, then we should support this war by the state of Israel against the new Nazis. And these new Nazis were even worse than the old Nazis because the old Nazis tried to hide their crimes against the Jews. But these new Nazis, Hamas, and the Iranians, of course, and Hezbollah, they boast about their rapes and their tortures and their burning alive grandmothers and torturing little babies. They boast about it. These new Nazis are worse than the old Nazis, and we should support this war against the new Nazis because eventually, these radical Muslims, they say, and most Christians are not aware of this, they say, first, we're going to destroy the Saturday people. And then we're coming after the Sunday people. Most Christians don't realize that we too are the future enemies of these radical Muslims.
Yeah, something to really ponder. Now, my last question has to do with the fact that since October 7th, probably before, but particularly since October 7th, Israel has become a political, a moral issue that has not only polarized countries and citizens, but also Christian churches. Now, my question, is there any way that we could become agents of reconciliation, shed some light rather than heat to the conflict in the Middle East, in your view?
Well, yes, but before that, Ruben, should we talk about the accusation that the Israelis are practicing genocide?
Sure, we can do that as well, yes. Because, do you feel under pressure because of the events after October 7th? When Israel declared war against Hamas, not the Palestinians as such. Do you feel an extra pressure being a Zionist, a Christian Zionist?
Well, I don't feel the pressure, but I think a lot of Christians do. And that's
why is that?
Well, mainstream media, the International Criminal Court has declared that the Israeli government, the state of Israel, is guilty of genocide against the Palestinian people. And I would just like to speak to that a little bit, if I could.
Please. Yes, of course.
The problem with the mainstream media on this and the International Criminal Court is that they take Hamas propaganda at face value. Now, I would argue that the Hamas leaders tell lies whenever they open their mouths, and it can be proven. What is genocide? A genocide is the mass murder of a particular kind of people because they are that particular kind of people, and it's an attempt to destroy that whole people as a people. And if the 2 million Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel believe that they're the object of genocide, why don't they flee to the West Bank to live under Palestinian rule, where the Palestinian Authority rules? Why don't they flee, or why didn't, before October 7th, didn't they try to get into Gaza to live under Palestinian rule, the rule of Hamas? They're Palestinians. They didn't. And I've talked to some of them. I've been to Israel 23 times now. And my son and I did a walking tour of Galilee back some years ago. I wrote a long picture essay about this in Christianity Today. They didn't, because they told me they would prefer to live under the rule of the Israeli state than under Palestinian rule. They don't want to live under Palestinian rule.
Right.
The criminal court claims, and much of the mainstream media parrots that claim. Why have military experts like John Spencer, the British military historian, why is it that John Spencer and other military experts say that Israel has gone further than any army in human history to protect civilians, which has resulted in harm to Israeli soldiers, which has resulted in death to Israeli soldiers that they knew they would not have to suffer if they didn't care about Palestinian civilians?
Yes.
The real abuse, and typically in the mainstream media, we hear about all the abuses perpetrated by the IDF against the civilians in Gaza. No, the real abuse is by Hamas, using their own people as human shields, which international law condemns as a war crime. Sinwar, the previous leader, thankfully he was killed by the IDF, the leader of Hamas, and you can find him saying this on the internet repeatedly. He said, the more civilian deaths of my fellow residents of Gaza, the more civilian deaths, the better, so that we can blame them on the Israelis.
So that's the strategy.
That has been the strategy all along. And that's the real abuse. So that's, Ruben, I just wanted to say that because that's the atmosphere in which we live today,
It is very much so.
that the Israelis are accused of genocide, when it's just the opposite. The Hamas and all of radical Islam wants to finish out the genocide of the Jewish people that the Nazis started.
So what do we do about this situation? I would like to finish our conversation
Yes.
on a note of hope, if we may. I mean, is there hope for this conflict? How can Christians speak to the situation in not just a spiritual kind of way, but through practical means, practical action?
Right. Well, that's a good question. And you started asking before I diverted you.
No, that's fine.
To talk about reconciliation. And we're told by the New Testament to be agents of reconciliation. You're absolutely right. To be peacemakers. And I think there's two things we can do as Christians. One, we can befriend Jews who are in our neighborhood, at our work. Jews all over the world feel lonely and frightened and threatened because they are being threatened all over the world. It's a new explosion of anti-Semitism all over the world, as I think I mentioned as we discussed in the last podcast. And, reach out to your Jewish neighbors or friends and tell that you want to support them and you don't believe the lies in the mainstream, and that the state of Israel deserves support. And Jews in Spain, Jews in England, wherever your listeners are, Jews in the United States deserve protection. The fulfillment of the Jewish faith, which is the Messiah, and Messiah is translated Christ, which is the Christian faith. The Christian faith literally means the Messianic faith.
Exactly.
The Messianic Jewish. We should inform ourselves about our Jewish roots, and particularly about the war in Israel. The war in Israel today. And I would suggest that your listeners balance what they read and wherever they read it, in social media or here in this country, in the New York Times and the Washington Post, which largely you will not get a whole lot of truth from. The London Times might be better. The Guardian is not real reliable. In Spain, I don't know what the newspapers are, but I would say balance those sources, and particularly on the internet, whatever people read, balance those mainstream media sources with, I'll give you 4 suggestions here. The Gatestone Institute. It's online. I wrote an article for them once. They're very good, with perspectives every day that counter a lot of the misinformation, disinformation on much of the internet. The Jerusalem Post is pretty good, and that's online, and there's an English version. A good Israeli newspaper is called Israel Today. In Hebrew is Israel Hayom, which means today. But just type in Israel Today. It'll come up as free. And all of these are free, by the way. And also for the intellectuals, and I imagine a lot of your audience is intellectual because they're at your school, the tablet. Now there's 2 tablets. There's the Roman Catholic tablet, which is pretty good. And there's the Jewish tablet. And I'm recommending here the Jewish tablet. It's an online journal. It's very good. And on the military and political conflict, books titled Israel Matters and the New Christian Zionism have chapters on the political and military conflict.
That's right. I've read them and I can attest to what you're saying. Well, Jerry, Dr. McDermott, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us for this enlightening and hopefully interesting conversation. And thank you. That's all I can say. Thank you for your time and for being with us.
Well, you're certainly welcome. It really has been a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I extend my blessings to all of your students there at your school.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you want to know more about King's Evangelical Divinity School, visit our website, kingsdivinity.org, or follow us on social media. We will be more than glad to have you study with us if you are interested in any of our courses. See you on our next podcast.